So the post-war consensus, I want to talk about that here with some time that I got my coffee and ready to get this thing on the road and going. What I want to do is I want to do something like a series of videos. I'm planning two really for this. And for the first one here, I just want to kind of try and explain what this is. And so, because I think that the more we can understand something, the better equipped we are to deal with what it actually is. So you have, for instance, people like Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro out there, and they're just kind of just napalming this whole thing, and it doesn't really help to deal with it because first of all, so many people right now are so disillusioned with sort of legacy media, and they sort of in the old guard, and they kind of identify Mark Levin or Levin and Ben Shapiro with that old guard, and so they therefore just don't want to listen to them anymore. And the more they yell and holler, the worse it gets for them. So I don't think that that's helpful in dealing with this subject. I think you have to deal with what it actually is rather than just calling people anti-Semitic. I do believe many of them are, but just simply saying that, I don't think is going to really get you anywhere. It's we need to have some kind of intellectual rigor and credibility in this discussion. So what I want to try and do is try to provide some of that for you by going through a couple of books. Well, I mean, I'm not going to obviously be reading the books here, but just basically their general thesis to understand what they're arguing and how the arguments made in books like these have gotten us to this point. So, firstly, I just would say that we have, we're asking questions. How come popularity towards Hitler has suddenly become such a thing? Where does this come from? This anti-Jewish mindset, anti-Israel mentality? How come it just seemed to come out of nowhere. How did this happen? What's going on here? Why are people suddenly talking about Hitler like he might have been a good guy? And Churchill was probably a bad guy, and everything like that. Well, the two books I want to talk about, one of them I have here, the other one's in the other room somewhere. They are going to be this one here, which is Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Patrick J. Buchanan. And then the other one is going to be Return of the Strong Gods by R.R. Reno. These are two books that they're not the only books about this subject, but the two books that I have read, and just these two books alone have really kind of changed my mind in many ways about the whole how to approach World War II history entirely. I'm going to start with Reno's book and the general idea that Reno's arguing in his book, Return of the Strong Gods. Reno makes the case that after World War II, after that was over, there was a consensus that was formulated. So the post-war consensus. That consensus was formed by liberal thinkers, and the idea is that you start with the assumption or the presupposition that Hitler is literally Satan, the incarnation of Satan. He is the most horrible man who has ever existed. And of course, we can identify a lot with this because many of us, even watching this video, probably believe that, and because they were raised on that. And the post-war consensus guys are going to say, see, that's part of the conspiracy, is to teach you that idea. So when you start with that, then you go on from that to basically say, and then any idea, however isolated, if it can be in any way associated with Hitler and his Nazi ideology, excuse me, is therefore, it spawns from the lava pits of hell. So ideas of national pride, just any kind of general traditional ideas of sort of like this the simple ideal of a of a singular great truth that is exclusive to all things. And for Hitler and Nazi Germany, it was the Aryan race that was the ultimate truth of humanity and at the exclusion of all other races, kind of thing, which manifested in his a Nazi ideology, and nationalistic, ultra nationalistic perspectives, you might say. So that must be abolished. All of that, any semblance to any such idea of nationalism, national pride, should be replaced with a kind of postmodern, multicultural ideology. In order to prevent another Hitler from ever happening again, these are the measures we must take. And so there was a great thrust or a great push to ensure that this was how future generations would be taught for the rest of humanity, hopefully, and hence creating basically the post-war consensus. That's societies of democracy, societies of inclusiveness, again, multiculturalism, that kind of thing. And Reno's case in the book is that the postmodern ideas of a multicultural, super coexisting kind of thing, even though on the outset it sounds like a great thing, but what it's going to do is it's going to mesh cultures in so much that they sort of just get so infused to form this one thing, and they all lose their own identity completely into this one amalgamated monster of being swallowed up in this one thing, and therefore none of them ever exist anymore. It's sort of like the same thing as in communism, when communists would make the case that you won't own, or everybody won't own everything. It all belongs to everybody. But the problem with that is when everybody owns everything, nobody actually owns anything. That's sort of the same issue. And so Reno wants to he wants to dispel the notion that Hitler is literally Satan. He wants that to be removed from society, and he has a vision for the future, that nationalistic pride is actually a good thing, that we can have pride in national fervor, and it's a sort of competition between nations as we once had, without the Hitler stuff, basically. And that's kind of what his point is in his book. That's what he wants to see. And so he goes through the book various thinkers who have led to this kind of postmodern, post-war consensus idea, and the thinkers that have resulted from the post-war consensus and how they've become influential in our society today, and stuff like that. And so that's kind of what Reno is arguing, that the post-war consensus was designed essentially, whether consciously or not, but essentially to destroy traditional values of the family structure, national pride, and things like that, and replace it with a kind of multicultural, utopian sort of dream world. So that's his general idea. Now, when we come to Buchanan's book, Buchanan's book is also very fascinating, and again, it changed very much in many, many ways the way I understood World War II. In some ways, not in a good way, and I've repented of those. And we'll talk about that in the next video, the problems I have with especially Buchanan. But in Buchanan's book, he calls it the unnecessary war, because he's going to make the case that World War II and World War I were two wars that were totally unnecessary, that didn't need to happen. And it was because that these two wars happened that they are really the point in which Western society began to collapse. Now, he makes the case of World War I being unnecessary as just being a complete failure of diplomacy, which is largely an accepted thesis in academia, one I certainly agree with. Again, I'll talk more about that later. But in Buchanan's book, when he goes into World War II, the unnecessary reality of World War II, typically when you talk about could World War II have been avoided in these kind of counterfactual arguments or discussions, typically people would argue that it could have been avoided if Chamberlain hadn't done the appeasements in Munich. You know, that if he had just called Hitler's bluff, that they could have avoided all of this, and it was because of this that led to that's typically how you would normally would do it. I would think, at least. I mean, that's how I've always heard it. Buchanan doesn't do that. Now, he does criticize appeasements, but for different reasons. But I don't want to go too far into that. That's not the point. Buchanan makes the point, particularly in chapter 9 of his book, which he titles The Fatal Blunder. He thinks that it was the war guarantee to Poland that was the fatal blunder on the Allies that led to the unnecessary outbreak of World War II. Now, how does he make that case? Well, first of all, Buchanan kind of tries to, one of the things he does, there's a couple of things. Firstly, he emphasizes Churchill's tendency to talk like a warmonger, and his love for war and his sort of antagonistic nature. And he basically leans into that to paint the picture that the actual aggressor to World War II, and even World War I, to be honest with you, was Churchill, not the Germans. It was Churchill, not Hitler. And if it wasn't for Churchill and his terrible policies, then World War II could have been avoided. And so he starts with Churchill bad, and then he goes to Hitler, and he doesn't say that Hitler was a good guy. Buchanan definitely was not a fan of Hitler, but he does sort of downplay Hitler's own aggressive agendas, which are very well documented. And we're going to get into that kind of stuff. But he sort of tries to paint Hitler as this guy who's like, I don't got any issues with the West. Well, why are they kind of trying to bother me? I just want to go east. And he thinks that it would have been better if we had just left Hitler alone to go fight the Soviets and let them duke it out, and therefore you solve the problem of Nazism and the problem of communism. And I get that point. I kind of believed that at one point, but my opinions have changed, as I like to think that they have matured. So that's kind of his general argument. But that because and so right before the Polish the outbreak of war that started with Poland, he tries to make this case that Hitler was seeking kind of a peace deal with Poland, that all he wanted was Lebensraum in the East, that kind of stuff, and didn't have any bad blood with Poland, none of that stuff. And so he was seeking to make a deal with Poland to get Danzig back, and that was about it. And then, out of nowhere, the Allies give, this is according to Buchanan, that out of nowhere, the Allies just give the Polish a war guarantee that if they would actually fight Hitler rather than try to talk to him, they would support them in war. And that then suddenly Poland was like, wait a minute, so I got the Allies, they have my back. Well, you know what, screw Hitler then. I'm not gonna talk to Hitler. We're gonna stand and we're gonna fight. And so they refused to talk to him any longer. And that sort of set Hitler off. And he threatens war, trying to get them to talk. They wouldn't, they refused to. And that's how Hitler makes the non-aggression pact with the Soviets, with Stalin, and hoping that would actually continue to force the Allies and the Polish to back down. Kind of that, and they didn't back down, and he kind of eventually war was declared. So the idea is to paint Hitler as the guy who was trying to he was the one who was trying not to mess with the West and trying to find a better way about this. And it was the Allies who were egging the Polish on to fight him and cause Hitler to start a fight. So it's the idea that Hitler reacted to aggression towards himself, is Buchanan's argument, and it got us stuck in a war that he says was unnecessary. It could have been avoided, according to him, if we had reacted differently to Hitler and all that stuff. All right. So, and then of course, what happens afterwards? We defeat Nazism, but at the cost of giving Stalin half of Europe and empowering the Soviet Union even more, which led to the Cold War. And that's Patrick Buchanan's point at the end of the book. And then the subsequent decline of the West, even though the Cold War is no longer among us, we still kind of live in the shadows of it, and even World War II, to be honest with you, and World War I. But So that's Patrick Buchanan's point. Okay, so that's the argument essentially, that the real problems of the West began in the outbreak of the world wars, and therefore we should have stopped those from happening. And if we were able to stop those from happening, then we would never have, well, things would be different, you might say. And that Hitler, maybe he wasn't a good guy, but he wasn't as aggressive as Churchill was making him out to be, and that maybe we need to point fingers somewhere else about the blame about World War II. So again, that's the point. So I'm going to talk more about the problems with particularly Buchanan. I can kind of generally get on board with Reno, I think, in many regards, and some with Buchanan. Again, we're going to talk more about this, but what I want to point out here is, so Brian Sauve, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. Apologies if that's wrong. Of I forgot the name of his church. Sorry, but in the Ogden area, the Ogden guys, they've said they've read Buchanan, and I believe them. But how many of their followers have actually read Buchanan? And how often have they themselves taken Buchanan's arguments and sort of ended up romanticizing Germany a little too much, especially Nazi Germany a little too much, and soft pedaling Nazi Germany and its well documented aggression. And then began to teach this stuff to their people. I read a quote a little while ago on a friend's posts, said that what leaders say in moderation, their followers will do in like radicalism, basically, something like that. So the idea basically being that you might say this one thing and you might keep it sort of moderate, but your followers are probably a little bit more unhinged and more into wanting to see and push the envelope even farther. So it's not too hard to go from the idea that maybe Germany was misunderstood, maybe the bad guys were actually the ones on our side. So you flip the script completely. And once you've flipped that, you've sort of opened the Overton window, as it were. It's not too hard for people to then start to jump even farther from that, to go, maybe Hitler actually wasn't the bad guy. What if we've been lied to this whole time? And the real good guy was the one who's trying to stop the communists. Because one of the things these guys are doing is they're trying to tie all this sort of things going on with Israel today, and Epstein and his client list, and the Jewish connection, which I don't really see a whole lot of evidence for, other than that maybe many of these connections are tied to people who happen to be Jewish. That's not really proof of anything, but that's where they go. So they're making all of these connections, and then they are recognizing that Hitler was going after the Jews. And they're thinking maybe, so they start to go, what if Hitler was actually onto something? Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he actually was right. The Jews were the problem. They were the ones who were financing everything according to Hitler, and they're still doing that. What if they're still doing that today? And so it's from that point, it's not too hard to then go, he's going after the Soviets. Like, his biggest enemy is Bolshevism, communism. And you find out that, of course, the founder of communism, Marx, was Jewish. And then they start finding, there's a bunch of Jews in Marxist leadership, communist leadership, Trotsky. I was asking these guys one time in this Facebook post about, can you give me any proof of this, like that the Jews are inherently involved in all leftist propaganda and communism and transgender. And the guy was pointing at me, well, Marx was Jewish, Trotsky was Jewish, and then they say things like, well, then Stalin and Lenin, they had Jewish family members, and so they managed to get Stalin and Lenin in there on a technicality. So anything to get them in there, basically. So then it's not to go from that to go, Hitler trying to stop communism. Communism must be a Jewish creation to take over the world, and they almost did in the Cold War. And now they're doing it in a different way because they lost the Cold War, but they're still bent on taking over the world and all this stuff and blah, 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 blah. And so now you just basically go from that to saying Hitler, maybe he was the good guy. Maybe he was the one who was trying to stop something evil, and we all just treated him. The Jews, because they controlled all the world, they were able to get all the countries that they controlled to gang up on Hitler and take him out before he can get the truth out, basically. Is generally the conspiracy theory behind what a lot of these guys push. Now, the Ogden guys, I don't know if they're pushing that, but they definitely aren't pushing against it, as far as I can tell. They're not trying to push back against these extremist perspectives that are taking concepts of the post-war consensus and they're going just way out in left field with it. They just don't put the brakes on it completely. So that's the general idea of the post-war consensus and what it's arguing. There's other aspects to it, and we're going to probably dig more into that in the next video when we get a little more in detail about the history of these kinds of things. But for now, I just sort of wanted to set things up so that you understand kind of what they're basically trying to argue. And then the next video that I'm going to do, I'm going to talk more about, again, documents, actual facts, documented history, so that just to help better equip you and me for how to deal with these things. We're going to do some history, okay? I personally am a big history geek, and that's one of the reasons why I was not able to go down this dark road with many of these guys who've gone this far. The the new Christian right guys with Webben, the Ogden guys, and many others, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. I just, anyways, so I'll save that for the next video. Until then, I hope this is helpful and useful to you guys. See you later.